Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is dedicated by Mikey Stone, Le'ila Nishmas, Mordechai ZT'L, and in order to promote the careful study of the Rambam's Torah. This podcast is somewhat of a review of this past Sunday's episode about the New English edition of the Moreh with Professor Len Goodman. It's also worth noting that Rabbi Burton's written review of this new edition of Moreh was just published in the winter edition of Jewish Action. I will link to that in the show's notes. Also, the second edited volume of Kisvei HaRambam in English was just published by ArtScroll, and Rabbi Burton is one of the editors of that volume, so I'll link to volume 1 and 2 in the show's notes, as well as, of course, linking to this edition of Moreh for those interested in that. To sponsor an episode or to support the show, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the information and the links in the show's notes below. You can also subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and the like, and you can find the link in the show's notes. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Burton, who is a senior editor at ArtScroll, and he's the author of numerous Sfarim, the most recent Haaretz Asher Areka, and he also is a writer. He has his own Substack, which is like a blog called Unapologetic, as well as he writes in other areas. He gives shiurim, including those on Moreh, which is the subject of this podcast episode. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Moreh of the Rambam, Maimonides, and the reason for that is the previous episode on the podcast was a podcast episode with Professor Len Goodman, who just published a new full translation, a new English translation of the Rambam's Moreh called The Guide to the Perplexed, a new translation, translated with commentary by Len E. Goodman and Philip I. Lieberman by Stanford University Press. And really, the impetus for this podcast was I put that up on the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp and the Sfarim Chatter Twitter even before it came out, and then once it was published, there was a lot of interest. I could see that also tangibly. So I put links to Amazon, which I have an Amazon affiliate, by the way, for those that aren't familiar. So you can click on Amazon links, you can support Sfarim Chatter that way. And I said many orders came in, and I heard a lot of feedback, a lot of comments on Twitter, private messages on WhatsApp. Like, people were excited about this. And it is a monumental thing. It hasn't been done in decades, a full new translation, one volume. So there was a real interest. So that was the previous episode with Professor Goodman. And so Reb Shnayor was here tweeting on Twitter, on his Twitter account, talking some comments on it. And, we talk, and it came out. We somehow came up with the idea. Let's have a review by someone other than the author. Let's talk a little bit about this. So that was the impetus, the idea, the reasoning behind this podcast. So this episode we'll start off at the beginning. We'll get into a discussion about that edition, examples, what Rabbi Shnayor thinks about it, pros, cons, and then we'll talk a little bit in general about Moreh, a little bit more, diving in a little bit more. So I do want to say that this episode is sponsored by Mikey Stone to promote interest in studying the Rambam. And with that, let's jump right in. So thank you again, Rabbi Shnayor, for joining me.
Nachi, it's a pleasure to be here, as always, to talk about important topics, and especially this topic, which is one of my greatest passions, is the study of the Moreh. I look forward to talking about why that's the case, and specifically about this new exciting edition that came out.
I think the first thing that you've been on the podcast a number of times, so I always ask the listener, the guest, but I think here it's worth asking you your interest specifically in Moreh. This is something that you are really interested in. Anyone who knows you knows that. So, and especially then for those that don't know you, tell them, why and how did you become so interested in Moreh?
So I studied in a classic yeshivas where Moreh was not part of the curriculum if it made it to the shelf. I discovered it on my own, always being self-motivated and curious and looking at new areas to think about and study, especially in Torah. And this would be about when I was about 20 years old. I discovered it, and since then I haven't left it. Which I would comment that the Rambam himself, in his introduction, advises and recommends that you should study it constantly. So the fact that it's been my intense study for decades now is in line with the Rambam's intention for this book. I give shiurim on the Moreh, a weekly share at this point for the last 3 years, and also we have some series that I've done on selected topics in the guide, which are published. My great and abiding interest in the Moreh Nevuchim specifically. I think to explain that, I think we could think about the fact that if you want to understand Torah, if you want to understand ideas in the Torah on the most fundamental level, if you want to bring down the teachings of the Torah to basically what we call reason or thought or philosophy. Okay, philosophy is a word that people are weary of, so I'm going to avoid that word. But basically what that means is thinking. And if you want to do real thinking and understand the Torah on a fundamental level, that's not something that your average sefer offers you. If you want to think about, okay, the reasons for the Torah or the truest meaning for the Torah without making assumptions, what does the Torah mean if it's translated into the language of thought, into the language of political thinking, into the language of psychological thinking? The Rambam also talks about the nature of language is a lot of what his book is about. So really fundamental philosophical ideas or fundamental scientific or intellectual ideas, if you want to approach the Torah that way and do it with a master scholar, Talmud Chacham, that unparalleled, then the Moreh Nevuchim is for you. And that's what I found it did for me, that we tend to take things for granted in Torah because we're raised with it. The Rambam himself talks about this in one of his chapters in the Moreh, where he says that one of the big reasons that people make errors, a new reason, a modern reason, he says, is that we have sacred books, we have Tanakh, we have Chazal, and we take that for granted because we're raised with those teachings, that we stop thinking about them critically. And what that means for the Rambam is not that we're supposed to criticize and question the veracity, but that if you don't think about ideas critically, then you're likely to not understand them. So if you want to say, look, I accept the Torah as true, but I want to understand it, which is the premise of the guide. He writes in his introduction that the guide is written for someone who is certain of the truth of the Torah. So that's not up for debate, but he wants to understand it in light of reason. And I don't think there's any other classic sefer that quite does that, which is why I find it so important, so compelling. And I also find that its importance is abiding. It hasn't changed even today, perhaps even more so today with the passing of centuries and more books that are considered canonical and that we accept as being true. There's even more of a need for people to say, hey, let's think about things critically. Let's learn to think about the Torah in the language of, like as I said before, politics, psychology, obviously theology, because ultimately the Torah is about life. So therefore the Torah has to be made reasonable. And I'm going to clarify that. Made reasonable is not an apology. It's not that, we have to justify it and we have to explain the reason for it because otherwise maybe it's false. That's not the question. The point is that clearly the Torah is talking about things that are part of being human. Relationships. Again, political science, how to order a society, what is the good, what is the nature of the good. And these are the kinds of questions that the Rambam introduces you to. He forces you to think about things on a very fundamental level, like no other book does. Something from the guide that illustrates that, I think we might switch back and forth between the guide and the Moreh, so you'll bear with me on that. Something that that really illustrates this. It's an amazing thing. The Rambam in the introduction to the Moreh talks about the 7 reasons that you might find contradictions in books. And that's generated a lot of controversy, specifically the meaning of the 7th cause for contradictions. But right away, you have to just step back and say, wow, this book is like no other book. Because what book have you read that in the introduction tells you why books in general contain contradictions? So right away, that tells you that this book is doing something different than any other book. But what I want to bring to this discussion, because it shows you what the guide is all about. The Rambam says the 6th kind of introduction that you might find in any book, the 6th cause for contradiction, is that a person writes one thing in his book and writes another thing. And if you dig deep into the background, into the premises upon which his statement is predicated, then you might find that it conflicts with the other statement. So in other words, you have two statements that don't conflict on the surface level. But if you start thinking like, okay, what would make this statement true? So you say, well, it's clearly making this assumption and that assumption, and you could build it up philosophically. And then you'll find that therefore it conflicts with a different statement. So it's sort of like a cheshbon kind of kasha, where you realize that this kind of idea must be assuming X, Y, Z. The Rambam says an amazing statement. The Rambam says that basically all other books, all other Sfarim, have this kind of contradiction. And of course, when Rambam says all those Sfarim, he means we're talking the Kuzri, Asag, Amunah Rama. There were many other Sfarim that preceded the Rambam that dealt with the issues of theology. And all of them have this problem. All of them have this contradiction. But his book, the Moreh Nevuchim, does not have the sixth kind of contradiction. So why is that? Why does the Moreh Nevuchim not have the sixth kind of contradiction? Because what the Rambam is telling you here is that he did not start by taking assumptions from the literature and saying, okay, I heard this, I heard that, I know this, I know that. Everything in the Moreh Nevuchim is built from the bottom up. Everything is built from the foundation, so that you can never catch him, he asserts. You cannot catch him on that kind of error that people tend to make, because this is what people do all the time. They think they know something to be true, but they didn't develop it from its foundations. So they don't realize what their beliefs are actually implying. And the Rambam is saying he doesn't make that kind of error. So what he's telling us is, if you want a study of Judaism, a study of the Torah that starts from scratch, this book does it like no other. And it shifts your complete way of thinking. If you're studying Torah, generally we just take ideas for granted without even thinking about them deeply. And what the Rambam does for you is he forces you to completely shift your way of thinking till you get to a really root, bottom, fundamental level.
So I'm sure we'll discuss more as we go through this episode. But what's kind of interesting about this episode is that this is really a book review episode in like kind of audio form, a book review. In some sense, of course, we're going to do much more than that. It's not always that, although I talk to authors about their books, not necessarily a book review. And this one really, as I mentioned in the beginning, was conceived as a book review. And so, and by the way, you have a review. I'm not sure when this podcast is being posted, this episode is being posted, and when your review is coming out, but you have a full review written that's going to be published in Jewish Action, or was when this comes out. You also have a thread on Twitter that I can link to where you kind of make a lot of points about this book. So that's kind of what this is. I think we should go there, especially not necessarily, but if you didn't listen for the listener, go back and listen to the prior episode with Professor Goodman. You can hear from the author, editor, what he did, and now we'll go into. So let's talk a little bit about that. And again, we'll bounce around talking about Moreh Nevuchim, or the guide, and some about this new edition. So this new edition is a completely new translation from the Arabic with extensive notes. You got it. Your first tweet you put out, you were very excited to receive the book. And as you, that kind of changed a little, spoiler alert for those that saw your tweet. But what is your take? Its advantages and its flaws, its milas and chesronos, as you went through the book with examples, that you can point to. And here we're really referring to the translation itself, because it's a new translation from the Rambam's Arabic, the notes, and anything else that may jump out at you that you want to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, so like much of the Torah world and world that cares about the guide and the Rambam in general, I was really excited from when I heard that there's a new translation coming out. So first, let me just talk about, why was I so excited? Why is this such exciting news? There are a lot of translations of the guide. There are two in English that are very popular and then used by those who study the guide in English. There are numerous translations in Hebrew, and we could talk about them. What is a new translation doing? Why is this exciting? What this new translation promised to do, set out to do, and to a large extent did, was to make the guide very accessible. Because a weakness, or perhaps a barrier to entry might be a better word, of the existing translations is that they're difficult. They are a very scholarly kind of read, a high level of English, and they can't be read casually, which we'll get to this. Maybe that's not necessarily such a bad thing. But nonetheless, the fact is that many people who would read the Moreh, English speakers, are put off by the existing translations. So I'm always excited to see any new translation of the Moreh Nevuchim, and there's always things to learn from any new project on it that's well done, as this one was. So I was excited for that reason, but I was also excited for the particular angle that he's taking, which is that he's going to update it and present it in a way that's very accessible, smooth, and modern. And in fact, he has done that. So that was really exciting. As I wrote on Twitter, this was not a parable. It was the literal truth that I put on my Shabbos clothing when I finally received this edition in the mail. I was really excited. And I jumped right in. And I was really excited. I mean, it's a beautiful book. It is a pleasure to read. And you can sit down in bed. And not that I recommend reading the Moreh in bed, but if you want to read in bed, you can read it in bed. Well,
kind of a heavy nighttime read. I don't know that that's what I would pick if we're going to sleep.
It's like it's not that we sleep when we're learning. It's that we learn when we're going to sleep. But the point is that this is a book. It's a book, and I'm calling it a book specifically. Obviously you can call it a sefer, but I'm saying you can approach it like you approach a book, pick it up and read it. And that's something that hasn't been the case thus far. Certainly not in English. In Hebrew, there are more accessible editions, but in English, this is finally one where it's like, there's no excuse anymore. If you know how to read English, if you're a reader and you haven't read through the guide from cover to cover or whatever, more or less, that's no longer excusable. The footnotes too make it very accessible. So that's something that I was really excited for this volume to come out, and it has achieved that.
And also, just to jump in, as I mentioned on the previous episode, it's one volume as opposed to two. The Penis one is 2 volumes. This is 1 volume. It's hardcover. It's $50, a little less on Amazon. So it's really, kind of affordable. It's all there. It's all compact in 1 volume. So all that is nice. It's
nice. It's got a nice cover. It doesn't have that off-putting feeling that let's say the Penis one feels academic. You have that introduction, and then you got the Roman numerals. Not that we have anything against Roman numerals, but this has a modern feel. It's a book. It's a book that you can pick up, absorb, digest. It's great for that. For that, it's wonderful, and I really welcome the fact that I imagine, as you said, it's engendered so much interest in the Moreh Nevuchim. So it's a really exciting moment for the Torah world and for people interested in the Rambam to talk about this edition, but to talk about the Moreh in general, because I see that there's been a lot of interest building in the Moreh Nevuchim in general over the last decades. But this moment when this came out it's great. It's bringing people in who may have not been involved thus far. So that's wonderful. So after spending a lot of time reviewing it, I was really excited. I didn't read the whole thing, but I read a lot of it. I found that what it achieved in smoothness of presentation was at a sacrifice of clarity. The Moreh Nevuchim, as I mentioned, the other editions are challenging to read. And the thing is that's not a bug. It's sort of a feature of the Moreh Nevuchim.
You mean just to jump in, not only the translation. So the Rambam wrote this in Arabic, and the Ibn Tibbon translation is notoriously literal, and so that's hard. And then there's been other translations. So you mean do you mean, or clarify, from a translation point of view, it's hard to read, or the Rambam's actual content is hard, and this new edition tries to try to make both of them easier, or what are you referring to when you say
Okay. Yeah. So I'm familiar enough with Arabic that I'll consult the original all the time, and I could read it in the original. I'm not sufficiently expert in Arabic to judge the smoothness of the original. I'm not close to that. However, that being said, from my understanding, from my approach to the original Arabic and my using it constantly, it does seem that, as you said, Ibn Tibbon is a literal translation, and what he's presenting in Hebrew is essentially the exact same thing as in Arabic. So that same kind of difficulty or stiltedness, maybe you could call it, that you see in Ibn Tibbon and in English and in Penis in English is present, from what I can tell, in the original. But go ahead. And
Goodman kind of removes that in your mind?
He removes that. So what we see in this new translation is that it's gotten to the point where I can sometimes predict that there's going to be a smoothing over in the new edition because Rambam will drop something that, if you're reading closely, makes you stop and scratch your head and say, what's he doing there? And that's where the Rambam is hiding some secret or alluding to something. The Rambam was a master writer, as everyone knows from his other writings. And the masterfulness of his writing, to me, is apparent in the guide even more so than any of his other writings. The difference is that in the guide, you really have these statements that make you stop, and it doesn't read smoothly. The Rambam will say something that's odd. And like I started saying, it's gotten to the point where I've said, I'm looking at something in the guide and I say, hey, I'm going to go check the new edition. I bet they tweak this over here to make it flow. Let me think of an example of that.
Yeah, I'll let you find an example of that. So it's what you're saying right now is the translation that they've kind of smoothed over, and because of that smoothing over process, while that makes for nighttime reading in bed, as you're saying, it does take away sometimes when, a diak, something that you could kind of is hidden in the meaning of the Rambam's words, now may be gone because of that. But also,
it's gone. It's completely gone. You can't find it. Try it. Exactly.
Yeah, if you can find an example of that, I think that would be very helpful to the listener to show them what you mean by that, and if you have the new one versus the old one, and you can explain to them something in that. And then the other part that I was going to ask you while you're looking, and tell me if you found an example, was just about the content, or is that one and the same? Are they tied together, intertwined? Does he smooth? Is in this edition, is the content kind of smoothed over in your mind, even the concepts, not only the translation of the words, or is that really intertwined?
So the thing is like this. The thing is that the Moreh itself was written that if you don't stop at these places and make those diukim, you could still get the sense of the book in general. And this is how I presented it in my Jewish Action review, which is either forthcoming or has been published already, that essentially the Moreh was written, and you see this in the introduction, it was written on two levels and for two different people. It was written for a person who can appreciate the surface level meaning, but doesn't necessarily understand that same depth that someone who's very advanced in his philosophy and Torah study can find in the guide. So for that person, for the one who's getting the surface meaning of the guide, the new edition does a generally fine job. But if you're looking, so we're talking about that level of meaning, the kind of meaning that you'll get by reading it casually. But if you're going to look for the deeper meaning, which is there if you search for it and put it together, and people have been writing about these questions, some of the problems in the guide, some of the diukim in the guide from the Barbanel, and really even before him. But I mention his name specifically because he does a lot of really being the dayak. Here, look at the Rambam uses that word, and how come here he uses one word, a different word? Until this day, you have people still finding depths in the guide that people haven't fathomed until now. So that deeper level meaning is the one that has completely disappeared from this edition, cannot be found.
So, yeah, one example I know that you right away referenced on Twitter was the beginning of the Rambam talks about Tselem, Udmus. I know that's something that I think you discussed that this edition you weren't happy with some of the things that over there.
Yeah, so I could explain that. I mean, the first parak of the guide talks about the meaning of man being in the image of God. And I'm going to point out a couple of points on that chapter. One of them is very nuanced, and one of them is more critical, I would say. What's the guide's objective? Okay, so if you haven't familiar with the Moreh, they think one of his major objectives, which is certainly true, is to de-anthropomorphize God, to make us understand that Hashem is not only not a body, but also has no bodily affects, has no attributes, nothing comparable between him and anything else that exists. That's a very important concept in the Moreh Nevuchim. So what he does in the first approximately 50 prakim is he deals with terms. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that you'll learn from learning the Moreh Nevuchim is to start thinking about language. What makes words words? Is it that they were used by different people, or does language come from God? Lishon HaKodesh, or is it man-made? How to think about the fact that some words have more than one meaning, which of course brings you into logic. So you see how you can get into really fundamental philosophical issues when you're studying in this way. So one of the things Rambam wants to do is tell us that the words in Tanakh that seem to suggest on the face of it that Hashem has a body or something, some bodily attribute, actually mean something else. They have more than one meaning. So this is an important idea. Words have more than one meaning, and you have to understand in different contexts they could have different meaning. Parenthetically, this is an interesting point, which I think is just a general point to make. It's interesting to think about. The idea of words having more than one meaning, I've discovered at least twice to have important ramifications in Mishnah Torah, in Halacha, in Shtickl Torah. There's something in Zvachim. I gave Shurim in Zvachim for a while, and there was a sugi in Zvachim where the Rambam says that, we'll get a little bit into the Lumdus over here. The Rambam understands that there's a contradiction whether a Tvul Yoim is called Tameh or not called Tameh. And this problem of whether, but tell me if this is okay to go into a little bit of a Lumdus over here. Would that be all right? Okay. So this problem of a Tvul Yoim being called Tameh or not leads to a stira that Taisus deals with. And Rav Daniel Abavli jumped in on the Rambam, and there was a problem with the Rambam. And Rabbi Burton ben Rambam, who defends his father, says if you don't understand that the word Tameh has two meanings, then you're missing something very fundamental. And he really carries on about how could you not know this idea. So in other words, Tvul Yoim is Tameh, and Tvul Yoim is not Tameh. How could that be? Well, because the word Tameh has more than one meaning. And the concept that words have more than one meaning is a very important idea, extremely important idea. And by the way, it seems like it's so basic. Like, of course, words have more than one meaning, but it's not so easy to wrap your head around it because really, the Rambam is saying that when it says something's Tameh and it says something's not Tameh, they could both be true, right? Just like you could say something is a sale and it's not a sale because there's two different kinds of sales. There's a sale of a boat and there's a sale in a store. So yeah, but here we have the exact same word and the exact same root. And I'm saying it's more than one meaning. So therefore something can be A and not A because A means two different things. And that's a very important idea in philosophy or theology and understanding the Torah, but it happens to be, it also carries over to Lumdus. And this is just a point I want to make that I see the whole corpus of the Rambam's writings. And by that, I mean his Pirush HaMishnayos and his Sefer HaMitzvos, and of course the Mishnah Torah and his letters and his Tshuvos and the Moreh. It all works together. It all goes together. And if you really want to understand the Mishnah Torah, if you really want to understand the Rambam's halacha, you have to understand the Rambam's, not only the Moreh, but you have to understand the underpinnings of the Moreh, the Rambam's philosophy. So this is one Rambam which we have to read all together. Okay, but going back to the point and the specifics of the translation, the Rambam wants to tell us that the words in the Torah which anthropomorphize God, that means suggest that God is corporeal, has a body, actually have another meaning. So what's an important example of that? Bereshis Perek Aleph says that man was created in the image of God. B'Tselem Elokim. How could man be created in the image of God if God has no image? So what the Rambam does in the Perek Aleph is to tell us that the word tselem doesn't mean shape, but rather also means, maybe only means the essence of the thing, the form of the thing. Form is a Greek, is a philosophical term. It means the thing, whatever makes something what it is. So what makes man what he is his intellect. And you see right away we're getting into philosophical ideas. What makes something what it is? That's a Greek idea, but it's a very important idea to the Rambam. So we want to define things. We want to say what makes a human being, okay? And what makes a human being is his intellect. Which suggests, and we'll get back to this point soon when I get to the details of the translation, that someone who doesn't attain intellect might not actually be a human being. He's in the shape of a human being. And this is a point that the Rambam says explicitly in chapter 7 of volume 1 of the guide, that you can have someone who is in the shape of a human being, but is not actually a human being, because the essence of being a human is having a certain quality, and that's intellect, specifically perfected intellect. You have to bring your intellect into actuality. Okay, so you read the guide and you think, okay, the Rambam's telling us something about God. he doesn't want us to misunderstand God. But then there's a deeper understanding over here. If you think about it, there's a deeper point going on over here. And this is something that if you read the first 7 chapters of the Moreh in this light, you'll see a lot of depth about psychology. Because the question of what does it mean that man is in the image of God, well, what is that a question about? That's a question about God, yes, but it's even perhaps more fundamentally a question about man. What is man? So the way you understand ZT'L Elokim, say God does have a shape. Okay, he doesn't, right? But let's say, imagine he did. Then ZT'L Elokim means we are the same shape as God. But what's that a comment about? The shape of our bodies. Now, by the Rambam shifting the word tselem to our intellect, which is what makes us what he is, he's telling us that the true essence of the human being, the important part of the human being, at least, is not his body, but his mind. So the discussion of ZT'L Elokim, and this is such an important idea in general in the guide, in the Moreh, a lot of people think that the Rambam is just here to dispel certain mistakes that people make. You know, Nebuch, some people thought that God was a body, so the Rambam has to talk them out of it and explain why that's not what Tanakh is suggesting. But actually, what he's doing is he's training us to become sublime thinkers, not only about God, but about ourselves. Because where your thoughts about God are, that's where you are. Because if God is the ultimate reality and you are somehow a continuation of that or a reflection of that, then how you think about God and how you think about yourself are very much intertwined. So you see the concept of ZT'L Elokim, the concept of what does it mean for man to be the image of God, is as much a commentary about God as it is about man, if not even more so about man. And that gets me to the first point. My first comment when I read this book, it was really interesting to me because the way the book starts, so we're talking about volume 1, chapter 1, there's a bunch of introductions, but volume 1, chapter 1, the Rambam quotes these words from the Chumash, Tselem and Mus. And then he says, in the Arabic, he says, people thought that Tselem means shape. And because they thought that Tselem means shape, it led people to think that God has a shape. Now, I never noticed that the Rambam begins his book with people, with the word people. I only noticed it when I read the new translation, and they flipped around the sentence, and they wrote, thinking that Tselem in Hebrew means the shape and contour of a thing has led people to share corporealism. So again, in the original and in every translation, it says, people thought that Tselem means the shape, and therefore they believed corporealism. Here they said, thinking that led people to that. So I was like, it's interesting because the Rambam, the opening word of his book is people. And this book is a book about people. You don't learn the Moreh and remain the same person. The Moreh is not here just to teach theology. The Moreh is to change you and make you a person whose mind and therefore your essence is sublime. So I think it's notable that he started with that word. And they made a choice, a literary choice, which you can quibble about that as well, that they're going to reorder the sentence. So that's an example. It might sound slight, but if you get used to reading the guide, you'll realize that Rambam is careful about this. That's one example of, a change, which, okay, you'll miss a tiny bit of a nuance. But, obviously you can question that. I'm going to tell you another one in the same chapter, which is much more fundamental. How about I'll read you know what I'll do? I'll read the translation from this new edition, and I'll compare it to let's take the Pinus translation, and you'll see the difference, okay? So this is on volume 1, chapter 1. We'll go further there. And the Rambam says, this is on page 20, the second paragraph. So I'm reading from the new edition. Tselem is said of the natural form that gives reality to a thing and makes it what it is, its essence as that thing. So Tselem, now I'll paraphrase, Tselem, the Rambam's telling us, means what a thing is. Okay, now I'm reading back in the Goodman edition. In the human case, this is the seat of our consciousness, the rational intellect. In virtue of what is said of man, in the image of God created he him. So what makes a human being what he is? What's his Tselem? Okay, that's end quote. Now, what does it say in this edition? That what makes a human being is the seat of his consciousness. What's the seat of his consciousness? The seat of the consciousness is, we can call it the brain, right? Or to be a little more, let's say, technical, we would say his ability to reason. What makes man in the image of God, according to what, if you would read this edition, you would say it's man's ability to think that makes him in the image of God, the seat of our consciousness. Contrast that now with the accurate, absolutely accurate. And that's something I'm going to parenthetically say that the Pinnis edition, whenever I've checked back to the Arabic, they are always extremely accurate. Some people feel that they had an agenda. I fail to see that. We can talk about that too, the Straussian agenda. I fail to see that in the translation. I always see strict fidelity to the original, to the point of, as we discussed, to the point of being difficult to read sometimes. But I'm going to read this excerpt from there, and you'll see the difference here, and you'll also see how in the new edition it just became smoother. So here I'm reading from the Pinnis edition. This is in page 22. The term image, on the other hand, is applied to the natural form. I mean to the notion in virtue of which a thing is constituted as a substance and becomes what it is. It is the true reality of the thing insofar as the latter is that particular being. In man, that notion is that from which human apprehension derives. It is on account of this intellectual apprehension that it is said of man in the image of God created him. Now, I'm going to, that end quote, and now I'm going to focus on it sounded like a lot of hard words to follow here, but I'm going to point out the key difference here. The true reality of man is, and I can read it again, that from which human apprehension derives. So again, that means the ability to think, the brain, okay? But then the next sentence says, it is on account of this intellectual apprehension that it is said of man in B'Tselem Elokim bara oso. So it starts off saying that what makes man man is the ability to apprehend, the notion from which human apprehension derives. But then it says that it's on account of the intellectual apprehension. That means the actually apprehending something, the actual knowing thing, that man becomes Tselem. So the Rambam does a subtle shift in not mid-sentence in the Pinnis, but in mid-thought. He does a subtle shift. He starts off by saying, you know what makes a man? The ability to think. And then he says, and it's his realizing thoughts, actually apprehending things and understanding things, that makes him the image of God. Now, what that means is that what makes man is being able to think, but only man who actualizes thought becomes in the image of God. And not every man is in the image of God. That is missing in the Goodman edition, which, to read it again, he says, in the human case, this is the seat of our consciousness, comma, the rational intellect. That's what makes man. He doesn't differentiate between, again, which is there in the original. The Rambam shifts gears and starts talking about what makes man in the image of God. And then he says, and then it's the actually apprehending that makes in the image of God. So that's a good example of something which, if you're really careful in the language of the original, you'll notice this subtle shift in meaning. And if you read it closely, you're going to think about that. And I'm not the first one to bring this up. It goes back to Abarbanel at least. And the Rambam makes this point that, okay, we want to define man. What makes a human being a human being? The ability to think. What makes him in the image of God? Thinking. That's extremely important because you're not allowed to kill a human being because he's in the image of God, not because he's a human being. So then if you define a human being by someone who has the potential to think, but you say that what makes a human being in the image of God is that he actually thinks, that means that some people are not in the image of God, a point that the Rambam makes explicit elsewhere in the guide and alludes to over here. But this kind of shift that the Rambam might do mid-sentence is exactly what makes it a difficult read. And again, that's a kind of difficulty which is there in the original Arabic, even though I can't attest in general to the whole flow of the Arabic original. But this is the kind of difficulty that's there. And what the new edition does consistently is papers it over, gives it a smooth veneer, and doesn't break up your reader experience, for better or for worse. Again, there's some good things about that. It's going to welcome a lot of people into the guide, but there's so much more there. In the guide, there's so much more than meets the eye. Here, it doesn't even meet the eye. There's no way you'll know that.
So if you have any other examples from the translation from the actual text, you can say them here, anything later in the book. But also something that I know you noted on Twitter, and perhaps you have some more to talk about, is the notes. So another big thing with this volume, this new translation, that there are extensive notes, which is nice. I think they're more than the peanuts. There are more notes. So, but there are some things in the notes, especially to other works of philosophy, are very nice and very welcome. But then I think there are some critiques or comments. Again, and by the way, I'm not only asking you to critique the book. Maybe there are some good comments you have as well. I'm just asking in general. Are there comments you have about the notes?
Yeah, look, it's worth knowing what is an improvement or an advantage of this version, of which there are many, and it's worth knowing what the you want to use the other versions for. Okay, we can get to this soon. I think the world still awaits the. I don't think it's perfect, but an almost perfect edition of the guide. There's definitely a lot that still needs to be done, but this has accomplished much. The footnotes are very interesting. I find that the footnotes, what he does in the footnotes mainly, and this is what it's really good for, in my opinion, is he does a lot of comparison with Greek and Islamic philosophy. So that's working backwards. In other words, backwards in time, talking about the Rambam's sources, and not even the Rambam's sources, sometimes things that the Rambam wasn't familiar with, specifically Philo, he quotes from extensively. And Philo is fascinating. Have you ever interviewed anyone about Philo? Because that's such a great and interesting topic that's been getting some interest recently.
I'm not sure. I had someone wrote something about the Philo al Torah, that a book that came out, a couple of volumes. Someone wrote something on the Svarim Chatter Substack. A few years ago, I was interested in Philo, but I don't remember if I did anything on the podcast. That doesn't come to mind. I don't think I did.
Well, you might think about that. I mean, what's fascinating about Philo is if you're someone like me who's very familiar with the Rambam, and then you start reading Philo, it hits you as, wow, these are the kinds of things that the Rambam would say. And what's interesting there, of course, Philo, from what I've read and what you've referenced, does a lot of Pirush of the Torah. And what you see from reading Philo is that those who approach the Torah with a certain kind of angle of what I call reason, or again, we could say philosophy, are naturally going to incline to read in a certain way. And some of the passages, they are really striking how they are so similar to the Rambam. But the Rambam did not have access to Philo, I don't know if he was aware of him. But that's something really interesting, that they bring those parallels. So they'll bring the parallels to they'll tell you where things are in Aristotle, Plato, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Ibn Rushd. So that's very valuable. They'll also do in the footnotes a lot of referencing moderns. So we'll get Aquinas and Spinoza and Solomon Maimon. And so it's really interesting. Something nice about this edition also is that they really make it clear that the guide is not outdated, and the issues that are on the Rambam's mind were on people's minds for hundreds of years afterwards, and still are today in many cases, and should be. So that's part of the fact that they really created a nice modern book here. What I would have liked to see more of is more of the rabbinical reception of the guide, and that's something which I would caution the readers of this edition to know, that the references to rabbinical sources, such as they are, sometimes I found to be imperfect or incomplete. So if you're familiar with those sources, you could definitely look them up yourself. If you're not, this should be a warning to take to know that there's a little something to be wary of here in some of the references and the accuracy of them. But also, the Moreh was a book that has been studied since it came out intensely in Torah circles until this day. So an edition of the Moreh, a fuller edition of the Moreh, would also give you the reception in the Torah world. So I would love to hear when there's a Avodas HaKodesh has something to say. Of course, the classical Mefarshim. I'm saying even the ones that argue. Ramchal, the Ramak, the Ramah, who references the Moreh in his Torah Sa'ila maybe hundreds of times. So, the Gra, of course. So tell the Ramban. So that's the context, the natural milieu in which the guide was received and studied most is in the Torah world. That is unfortunately less represented in this edition, and it sort of might skew your view of the Moreh. And that's an important point I want to make there, which is that we're still awaiting someone sort of to redeem the Moreh from having that image of which is gotten in the last 100 or so years of like being a little bit, not so much in Torah world, but that's not the real reception of the Moreh, and that's something that can be easily redeemed. Let me finish my thought. The new, the ZT'L's edition, that does a great job. The what's the name of the Machon? You would probably know.
Is it Das Funas? It's the one volume.
Is that the Hagos
maybe Hagos Funas or Hagos V'das? It's the one volume. They only did part one of a planned 5 volumes. It's like a Mekres Gedolos, for lack of a better word. Put everything together on Moreh Nevuchim.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's chapter 1 through 30. Yeah, and what that does is you read that and you see, and this shocks people because you see how much Chachmei HaDoros and Rabbanim of all the Doros engage with the Moreh. And that's something which an English edition should do as well, and really put the Moreh into its proper perspective and ground it in its right place.
So we can talk more about that, but some other things with it, I'm looking through some of your comments throughout your extensive Twitter thread, and you can talk further about this. There's other things you have to say about the translation. I know you made a comment there about what the Rambam says about Moshe. You also talked about what the new edition, you talked about Ma'aser Merkava. We can talk some of the famous ones in Moreh Nevuchim. I don't know if you looked at the ones where Ayash or Aya, where he talks about what the Yidden with the Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim before Moshe came thought and what Moshe was telling them and what was going on there. There's also the ones obviously about Karbanos. Again, these are showing out just some famous ones and some ones that perhaps you have some comments on or something to say about this new edition compared to the old ones and what you saw. Right.
Okay. I mean, so my comments on the translation. I don't think necessarily that the audience would care too much about the nitty gritty.
That you could read more in your Twitter, Twitter, which I'll link, and you'll be in Jewish. You go very nitty gritty. They're very tedious. You know, really diukim. You didn't like, this one you can be medayik this way because he said it like this, and over here it says it the other way.
Hello, it's a Rambam, right?
No, I know. Like for example, you say in Moshe, you say in 233, Maimonides writes regarding Moses, he who is greater than anyone born of man, according to Pina's translation. So you say this implies. So you talk about there are other translations. You said this translation says the greatest man ever born.
Right. So think about the big difference there, right?
Yeah, because in Penis there's a whole conversation. It implies that Moses was not born of man. You have a video on it and Strauss, etc. There's a whole tumult about this. But here it just says the greatest man ever born.
Exactly.
And it kind of, as you say, this is an incorrect and misleading translation. So that's nitty gritty. But just to throw out there, you talk about Ma'aser Merkava. I don't want to. You talk about also in Chelik Aleph, part 1, chapter 64, where it talks about the Shem Hashem.
Yeah, so let me explain that one because I want to make it clear. Very important. I love to say positive. I don't. It's not my character. I don't like to be critical, but I think it is important for people to know that there are some kinds of inaccuracies here that go beyond this kind of nuance that we've discussed thus far. And the one you just raised is a good example of that. The beginning of chapter 64, the Rambam begins, and I'm going to tell you what it says in the original. It says, Shem, Shin Mem, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Okay? What is the meaning of Shem, Yud Kei Vav Kei? And everyone knows that Shem, of course, is a word in Hebrew. And so what the Rambam is doing over there is telling us what the meaning of the word Shem is. When we talk about Shem Hashem, do we mean his name or do we mean Hashem himself? Okay? And similarly, the Rambam then extends that and says, Kavod Hashem. Does Kavod Hashem mean Hashem himself or does it mean a light, the Shechina that's created? So the Rambam is telling us what is the meaning of Shem Hashem. And in the new translation, what it says is the word Yud Kei Vav Kei, sometimes just means his name, and it could also refer to God himself. And it's not what the Rambam said. The Rambam said Shem, the meaning of Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. So that's a kind of so the Rambam is telling us what the word Shem Hashem means, not what Yud Kei Vav Kei means. The way it's translated is he's telling us what the word Yud Kei Vav Kei means. That's a great inaccuracy, and I would say it's inexcusable. And my point in saying it's inexcusable is not to level charges. My point is to say that unlike the other inaccuracies that I pointed out, and of which there are numerous, there are many of those, which seem to be an attempt, as we discussed, to sacrifice nitty-gritty nuance for overall clarity and smoothness. So those are excusable. In other words, I see the strategy there. I see the logic of them. This is a kind of error which there's no reason for it. There's no basis for it. It's simply inaccurate. So there is something to look out for. And, I didn't read through the whole thing. I did find a few other ones that are on this level, which I probably put up there on Twitter. If I remember correctly, I stopped at a certain point of putting things there. Perhaps at some point I'll continue if there's more interest in specifics. But the reason why I posted these things is because I wanted to bring some examples that, beware. I hesitate to say this, but it may be true that this is not fully reliable. So this might be a good introduction to the guide, but you have to be, you're only getting a general thing. You might learn some errors on the way, and that's why it's best advised to study this one along with other edition. Listen, Achi, I'm trying to be honest. I think that the Olam HaTorah and beyond deserves honest opinions here, right? So that's my feeling.
Yeah, I was going to say harsh, heavy hitting here on this Farm Chatter podcast. You're coming out swinging, which is so. In your mind, somebody here, anybody asks you, I want to learn Moreh Nevuchim, I want to start learning it. What do you recommend? Let's just come. What edition do you recommend? Now, obviously, there's a lot of editions. So if someone reads Hebrew, you have the classic Ibn Tibbon. Either you can get it in the one volume. There's all the classic commentators in the old print. You actually have Feldheim put out a new edition where it's just the Ibn Tibbon, a nice new print, but don't have the commentators. You have the Kabak Kafich translation through Mosader of Cook. You have Mosader of Cook has the 4-volume, and now it's the 1-volume. Eben Shmuel, I think his name is. You have that one as well. You have the Professor Schwartz, Michael Schwartz classic 2-volume through Tel Aviv University Press. That's like the gold standard now in Hebrew. There's the Mifal Mishnah Torah 3-volume with the light commentary. Because Professor Schwartz has small notes. The Mifal Mishnah Torah has commentary. There's the 1-volume we said of Zayval. That's also Ibn Tibbon with extensive commentaries and mafteach and indices and much more. So that's kind of a fancy edition of 1 volume. There are some other things. There are some commentaries that have been published through Bar Ilan University Press. Published some like old commentators. I think Camtiano, if I'm remembering from Byzantine. Camtiano, I think it was a Byzantine in the Byzantine Empire. He lived in like the 13 or 1400s. There are a lot of different things around, but those are the classics. There's also the, how can I forget, besides Ibn Tibbon, there's the Al-Akhrizi translation. He was the other, there are those issues with that, but he's the other Rishon, the other medieval translator of the guide. And then you get to the English. So you have the kind of the classic, was it the Freelander translation? There's it seems like if you're going to get that one, try to find the one that has the notes, not the one that doesn't have his notes. I'm still
looking for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to find. That's I've heard that one is good. It gives you his notes. Yeah. But otherwise there's his reprint without the notes. There's Pinas and Strauss, there's the 2 volumes, and now there's this one. So there's a lot there. Yes. Not a lot in English, mind you, but if you want to tell someone Hebrew English, what's your recommendation? Someone that wants to start learning Moreh.
Right.
And is it should they pick up 2 editions, have 2 different ones to look at different things? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so look, it all depends. First of all, some people might have a problem with reading advanced Hebrew, because there is no edition of the Moreh that reads like a Ramban al Torah. There can't be, because it's about topics that are more abstruse, and the language had to be developed for it. Of course, certainly in Hebrew, and medieval Hebrew language had to be developed for it, or you're going to be in modern Hebrew. So you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? So think about it in Hebrew. Well, what are your choices? You can have Ibn Tibbon. Ibn Tibbon is, you have to learn Ibn Tibbonese, essentially. In other words, people who are familiar with probably Chovos HaLevavos and other books that he translated, and it's as if it's its own language. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because here he was trying to express in Hebrew ideas, the authors of which chose to write in Arabic because, presumably, Hebrew was not rich enough to express these kinds of ideas that weren't that hadn't been in discussion for hundreds of years when the Hebrew language was being used. So they had to. So if they wrote it in the language which ideas were discussed, Arabic, and now he came to this challenge. The original translators came to this challenge of trying to put that into readable Hebrew. So they did a job, but it required something from the reader. Or you can say, well, we have modern Hebrew, and modern Hebrew covers all these terms, and that will take us to, let's say, the most recent edition, which I happen to like a lot, the Mifal Mishnah Torah version, which is very readable, but it's a modern Hebrew. So for your American, say, who may be comfortable with Sifrei Kodesh, is not necessarily going to be comfortable with any editions of the guide in Hebrew. There are things a little bit in between modern Hebrew and Ibn Tibonese, we can say. That would be Kabach edition is more or less classic. That was my first exposure to the Moreh. And that's a pretty straightforward read. So that's okay if you want to read in Hebrew. That might be the recommendation to start. For an American who's comfortable reading classical Hebrew, that might be the best place to start. If you want to read it in English. And, unlike other Svarim, there is no default position here that you should read it in Hebrew because anyways, we're talking about a translation. So you're not getting into the original regardless. If you're more comfortable in English, read it in English. The problem with that is that, as we discussed, you have these really difficult translations. The Friedlander is pretty smooth, but it's an old book. It doesn't have that feeling. It feels a little dense. It's not an easy read. So I would say if you're new to the whole enterprise and you really want to just get a feeling, then this new edition is a great place to start. I'm warning people about what it doesn't offer, partially to make it more likely and easier for them to study it, with knowing what to be aware of. So if you want to just get a general sense of what's going on in the Moreh Nevuchim, what's this all about, what's so exciting here, jump right in. This is a great place to start in this edition. Get a little interested in it, realize that there's more going on, and then, like you said, grab some of the other editions, compare, look for some of the shurim that are going on. There's lots of interesting things happening recently in the Moreh Nevuchim, and there's so much to get into there. Which edition you use is actually not necessarily the most important thing. It's more about starting. And then, the more you get into it, you can pick up some of the advanced editions. Of course, the Ibn Tibon classic one has the Mefarshim, the classic Mefarshim. So you definitely want that to understand them in the Rambam in the context of that was understood by the classic Rishonim.
So, okay, I will. That's really for part one of this conversation where we are, reviewing and critiquing and offering you're offering your comments on the Goodman-Lieberman edition, and I'll link that you can buy that as well as Professor Goodman's guide to the guy, his own introduction. I'll also link to your tweet thread on this. I'll link if the Jewish Action review came out. I'll link to it. If not. And so let's talk a little bit some Moreh stuff. I don't want to. We're already almost an hour in here. I don't want to go overboard with it, but I do want to talk some general things. Is that we talked about now this edition and what you suggest to listeners, and you've talked a little bit about Moreh, but just to emphasize a little more, why studying Moreh Nevuchim is important, and for who do you think especially it's important that they should pick up Moreh and start reading the guide? Right.
Yeah, so I think going back to the point I was making earlier, I think is a very interesting way to think about it. As time goes on and people take things for granted in religion, and this is true in other fields as well, but what we're talking about here is Torah and religion and Judaism. What happens is people tend to develop ideas that just sort of take on a life of their own. And in a certain sense, that's the cause of a lot of problems, even though we can talk about a lot of practical problems or things that we'd like to improve about our people, about our communities. A lot of those problems sometimes come because we take on some ideas uncritically. They're part of our upbringing, and they're just sort of how we think. And as I mentioned earlier, what that means is that we don't really understand them. So, what I recommend, what I believe is very important today is a critical engagement with the truths of the Torah. See, critical engagement means essentially it's based on the premise that you can't understand something that you don't question. And I'm going to say this again, I said it before, that when I say question, I don't mean to say doubt. I'm not advocating that we should doubt our emunah. As I said, the Rambam himself says the guide is written for someone who's certain of the truth of the Torah and wants to understand it. You could be certain that the Torah is worthwhile engaging with. That's true that it has a message, but we can say, well, what is its message? What is this all about? And I see this as so important in the modern era. We have to bring a certain kind of renewal to religion, to Judaism, to Torah. And that, I think, is going to come through this kind of critical engagement that the Moreh is a wonderful guide, as the title is, for that kind of thinking. Take a kind of example, which I think it's really a basic example. What are the mechanics of prophecy, or how does prophecy work? Now, that's a kind of question that very few people, even if they've been learning for a long time, even if they've been studying for a long time, and even if they learn Tanakh, and even if they learn Medrash and Agada or quote unquote Machshava, or even if they learn Kabbalah, they wouldn't necessarily ever ask that question like as a scientist, simply like, how does prophecy work? And that's not to say that it's natural. If your answer is, well, it's a miracle, okay, well, let's think about that. Well, what exactly is the nature of the miracle? But whatever it is, that's a kind of question that the Moreh engages with at length. And that's a kind of question that, of course, number one, so much of Torah thought is downstream of that question. For example, understanding the content of Nevuah, of course, understanding the nature of the message of Nevuah has a lot to do with the nature of Nevuah itself. How does it work? But besides for that, the question of how does prophecy work also touches upon questions of purpose, such as what is the function of the Navi? What is the function of the Torah? So you see, once you get to these kinds of fundamental questions, that opens up a world of thought. And I'm going to use a word here. It's like a world of reality, as in a world of realness. Ideas that we just sort of float or fly around start becoming real in a way that they weren't before you engage with them in that way. And I should warn the prospective student of the guide, once you get into that way of thinking, there's sort of no turning back, because you start engaging with Torah ideas in a much more fundamental way, in a much more real way, and it becomes difficult to engage in conversation with people who are not dealing with the Torah in the same way. And this is actually one of the things that the Moreh teaches us, is that the Torah is written in various levels. There's a level of the true meaning of the Torah, but that's accessible only through great work, and it's not accessible to what's called the Hamoin, the masses. And then the Torah is also written such that the masses can understand it. And one of the great tensions in the God is a political tension, as to say, a political question of how much do the masses know of the secrets, and how much do the cognoscenti know, and what are we supposed to divulge? Which brings us back to the question in the mission of Chagiga about divulging the secrets of the Torah. And the Rambam, a lot of that is a political question. I should clarify that politics is not a dirty word here in this conversation. Political, considerations are the highest considerations, as in what is the good for society. So we have these questions of like, there's the Hamain, there's the masses or the simple folk, and they have simple kinds of beliefs, or they believe in the Torah's truth on a simple level. But then there's this deeper level, which if you start thinking about it really deeply, that sort of becomes the only thing that's interesting. So the reasons for the Torah, what does the Torah want from us? What is the goal of the Torah? What is the ultimate good? And then, like I said, what is revelation? What is the meaning of the history of the Jewish people, of the history of the Torah? Is the Torah historical? Does it fit into a certain context? How does it apply today? All these are such basically fundamental questions, which you're not going to get unless you have a book like this. And like I said, I can't think of any other that quite does as the Moreh does, that really just engages you constantly with these kinds of questions.
So something that you mentioned earlier is that people think it's kind of outdated, quote unquote. And so I don't know if they think it's specifically outdated, but they're not like, maybe some of that. It's also some of people are scared of Moreh Nevuchim, of picking up Moreh Nevuchim. So what do you say to listeners maybe listening, and that's what they think, or that's right, kind of, what they're thinking about it?
Yes, I think there's a few, let's talk about 2 points about that. I think we can talk about people think it's outdated because a lot of the philosophical premises are Aristotelian, and people maybe are making assumptions about Aristotelian philosophy being debunked. And another aspect of that question we could discuss is that the Rambam's cosmology, his picture of the universe, has in fact been updated or debunked. His picture of the universe in brief, I think Professor Goodman probably discussed this in his conversation with you. I'm not sure if I heard this on that conversation, but the Rambam's picture of the universe was geocentric, and it was actually fairly simple. Earth was in the center, and it was revolved by the various spheres in which are embedded the sun and the moon and the various planets and the stars. And that's it. And that's his universe, basically, which is quite remarkable if you think about it, because what we know today about the size of the universe, we live in a different, we literally, quite literally live in a different world than the Rishonim did, which is just parenthetically something interesting to think about. In other words, their sense of being, their sense of space, of place in reality was so fundamentally different than ours because the universe was, as they knew it, was so much smaller than ours. Besides the fact that the Earth was in the center, which I don't think is as important as people think. But lots of people think that, they thought they were the center, and now we know we're not the center. That's not something I consider to be very important. But fundamentally, they had a very different orientation to the universe. So let's talk about those 2 points. Some people say, it's Aristotelian philosophy, and haven't we moved on? And I'm going to tell you what the Rambam would say to that question. Instead of answering it myself, let me speak on behalf of the Rambam. He would say the only way to make such a categorical kind of statement is to engage with the same questions that Aristotle was engaging with. So, classical philosophy, classical philosophical ideas, although people tend to think that, aren't we past that? Generally, the people that say that are those who haven't engaged with them and haven't studied them. And those who study them find that they're still very, very interesting and compelling. Whether there's what to be changed and updated, or updated is a funny word. Let's use the word criticize and correct. That's always true of all philosophy, of all thinking, and of Aristotle no less than everything else. Famously, the Rambam himself argues with Aristotle on some extremely fundamental matters. So the point is that although there are things that one might argue with, that is not a reason to say that this is not something to engage with. And I think also the point I raised earlier about what studying the guide does for you, I hope that made it clear that the purpose of studying the guide is not to amass more information. It's to have a different kind of approach, a different way of learning Torah, where you're thinking about foundational questions. And the perspective that the Rambam brings to that is less important than the thrust of his approach, which is, as I said, let's get things down to a real foundational level where we could talk about purpose. We could talk about what is the good of man, what is the final end of man, what makes a man perfect, what is a good life. So those kinds of questions haven't changed at all, even if the approaches to the answers to those questions may have changed. So that's to the point number one. To the second point about the universe changing, I think that's, although it is somewhat important in the Rambam's understanding of how the world derives from Hashem, it is much less important than people think it is. Certainly, if someone would be capable of doing the Rambam's kind of project, meaning to say, having the Rambam's kind of mastery and being steeped in Torah like he was, and have the kind of mastery of science that he did, but have it on today's science, that would be an amazing project. But it doesn't mean that the core ideas of the Moreh are still very important, still very relevant, even the ones that are linked to his cosmology, which has been, let's say, debunked. But also, I should say one word about that. The cosmology being debunked is we're talking about the geocentric model. The issues that the Rambam brings to bear on the question of creation of the world, which is one of the most fundamental discussions in the Moreh. Did the world exist forever, as Aristotle believed, or was it created ex nihilo? Which, of course, the Rambam comes down on that side. I gave a series of lectures about that for anyone that's interested. It's much more complex than it seems. But regarding that matter, I wouldn't say that the Rambam has been updated. Not that I'm a cosmologist or a astrophysicist or whatever it is that needs to know these things. And to repeat my point from before, if someone who knows his astrophysics definitely should engage with the question of creation anew. But it's not like fundamentally the issues that the Rambam is dealing with have changed have shifted in a fundamental way. So that problem is generally overstated, I would say.
Okay, so that, and then there's much more to go on there. A lot of these general things we're talking about, because we already ran long, I don't want to run, excessively long, like I've done on some of these episodes. We could really spend another hour plus 2 hours. You've given lecture series on this, and the Rambam and Kabbalah. What has Kabbalah done to Moreh, vice versa? We were talking about, and specific examples of topics. Another thing to talk about is topics in Moreh Nevuchim that are relevant and important today. I mean, there's many besides for just general topics. Besides for how important it is when he's interpreting concepts we know from Chumash itself, Tanakh itself. Again, you mentioned Nevuah, many other concepts. I threw out the famous one about Asher Eya that he talks about what's going on over there. Everyone's like, "What you think?
Yeah.
Like, what happened exactly?" Korbanah is obviously famously or infamously what the
reason
Rambam
for mitzvahs in general. Yeah,
the reason for mitzvahs exactly. Much of this is very important for anybody. So of course, but there's a lot to get into over there. So if you want to give one or two other examples about important things, you can. Before we wrap up, I can.
I think it's worth to say a word about Kabbalah. I think there's maybe two interesting points to make on that regard, which one of them might come as news to people. Everybody knows, okay, well, let's put that into scare quotes. Everybody knows that there's this dichotomy between the Rambam and Kabbalah. Now, that is to say everybody but for some people. There are a select few that question that. And I would say that, everyone who knows that there's this dichotomy, most of them haven't studied both the Rambam and Kabbalah in depth. So, you can't really understand something as deep as the Moreh, which is about the secrets of the Torah and the foundational ideas of the Torah, without studying it in depth. And certainly the same goes for Kabbalah. So this common wisdom shouldn't be accepted as true without criticism, without study. And that brings me to my point, essentially, which is that the differences are not nearly as great as people make them. Are there machlokeisim? Yes, certainly. There are machlokeisim within one Kabbalah and the other as well. There are some fundamental questions, such as the place of reason in the Torah, as opposed to revelation. That's a pretty fundamental issue. But fundamentally, they're not dealing with different topics. And this brings me to my second point, which is a very important point. The Rambam and the Moreh is the best introduction to Kabbalah that I could think of. And that's because what I find is that without engaging in the questions that Kabbalah deals with, which such as the nature of Hashem and the nature of his interaction with the world, okay, we could say that basically as the subject of Kabbalah, without engaging in those same questions in the way the Rambam did, which is through reason, what is going to happen is you're going to probably misunderstand or not fully understand what Kabbalah is doing. So much of the Kabbalah Sfarim are responding to the Rambam. So let's say the Avodas HaKodesh, for example, which is one of the fundamental Sfarim of Kabbalah, his Bar Plukta is the Rambam. And, he's responding to the Rambam. You have Marals, who he's answering to the Rambam. So the Rambam, even when he's not being accepted, he's the one who sets the subject of the debate. So not only does he set the subject of the debate, and therefore you have to really read him and understand him to see what people are responding to, but also he's the one who engaged in these subjects in a way that a person can reach real understanding. And then you can use that understanding and learn other texts, and you'll see them in a completely different light, in a deeper light. So I think the example I said before is a good example. I said people could study Kabbalah and not think about what Nevuah is. And that sounds like a shocking thing, because they might know lots of things about Nevuah, lots of words about Nevuah that come from Kabbalah. But I still maintain that if you haven't ever thought about it from a natural perspective, again, I don't mean to say that Nevuah is natural as opposed to miraculous. I mean natural perspective as in, let's explain this. Let's think about this like we think about everything else in the world. If you haven't done that kind of proper long-term engagement, you're just going to have a lot of more facts, a lot more words, and of course some understanding. Not to completely minimize that, but you're not going to have that kind of deep understanding that comes from a book that encourages you to engage with a topic like that on a level of reason, a level of thought. So those are, I think, two important points regarding the Rambam and Kabbalah.
Okay, so as you've talked about some of the different editions and what you, your advice and what you think that someone who wants to start, or obviously start, because if they're familiar with it, they can have whatever. There's many that you can own a lot. So, but what do you envision in a nature of a translation? Kind of like you said, there'll never be a perfect one, but what's something that in your mind would be the translation of Moreh, especially to English?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a need now for another one into Hebrew. But an English edition that reads as if it was written originally in English would be a wonderful thing. I mean, that's a Rambam's recommendation how to translate a book to his first translator was to write it as if it was written in the target language, which is not what Ibn Timon did. See, but in order to do that, you'll have to really understand the Moreh. You'll have to really get into the level of nuance and then start again from English. So firstly, I would say someone who's studied the Moreh for a very long time, like I said in the beginning of our conversation, the Rambam recommended studying it constantly. That's what he says, constantly. So, it takes decades of studying till you have a good sense of what he's up to. And I want to, as Chatoy Ani Mazgir, I want to say that when I say it takes decades of study to understand what the Rambam's up to, I say that as someone who thought he understood the Moreh after learning it for a year or two, and then after learning it for 5 years, and after learning it for 10 years. But only after learning it for decades do I realize that now I'm beginning to understand it. And, let's talk again another 20 years, and I imagine I'll say, I thought I understood it 20 years ago, and I didn't understand anything. So it takes a long, long time to have a feeling of what he's doing. And then someone with that kind of feeling could then rewrite it into English. It doesn't have to be a slavish translation word for word, certainly not important, if you really understand what he's doing. And if you're a masterful writer who can also plant those allusions with an A to these hints and allusions to all these secrets. So that would be wonderful. I think also a good pirush to the guide, something like an essay before or after each chapter telling you what the Rambam did in that chapter. I think that would be wonderful. So I would envision some kind of translation that's flowing English, as I mentioned, as if it was written originally in English, and something that gives you perspective, which to my mind means introductory essays to each chapter and or conclusionary essays to each chapter, saying, what did the Rambam do in this chapter? Where did he get us to? How does it link to other chapters? Because one of the big things that the Rambam does in the guide is he says, I'm going to write things here and there that you have to then connect to other chapters. So someone who could flesh that out and bring that out at the end of each chapter, that would be very, very valuable. So, there's still, and of course, as I mentioned before, if someone's going to give us the perspective of what the debates were, what some of the questions were, and references where those come up and how those played out in the conversation over the centuries, that would also be of great value.
Okay. So I think, is there anything else that you have to add here to this kind of Moreh Nevuchim / review of the new Moreh Nevuchim episode?
No, I think we got it. I think we hit it.
Yeah, there's
nice.
really,
it's a great read. It's a great read, the new one. But be aware that
I think what they were going for kind of was similar, obviously, to what Professor Schwartz did in modern Hebrew, kind of getting a real contemporary modern reading of the Moreh Nevuchim for today's reader. As you said, it was a hard. It's a notoriously hard read, and so this is really readable. Again, I'll take issue with what you said at the beginning. You read this in bed, but it is kind of a much easier read. It's really nice. That's hardcover, 1 volume. Again, it's on Amazon for generally always $46, unless it goes for less. So it's really that's really not expensive for a price of a book.
Yes, for a nice
today,
hardcover book. Yes.
Which is nice.
I just want to correct something. I mean, not that you made an error, but just to be clear here, that the Schwartz edition is quite accurate from what I see. I have not found that kind of smoothing over in the Schwartz edition, which you didn't say there is. I just wanted to make sure that's clear.
I was just trying to say that's what I think the Lieberman edition was aiming for, that kind of contemporary, modern reading of a work rather than just old-fashioned or the old, what Ibn Timon did, etc. So, okay, we'll see if anything comes out. And you, just to mention here at the end, I know that you're involved with the writings of the Rambam, a translated edition project with Art School that we'll have to do an episode on with you and Rabbi Gilson, who I've had on about the Rosh Hashanah. And I think you're working on another volume of that now?
So, again, depending on the timing here, there's the volume 2 is expected soon, or has come out, which is going to be that's volume 2 of the writings of the Rambam. This one is focused on the Rambam's ethical writings. So, of course, pride of place there goes to the Shemona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avos, and we're also going to be including his Pirush on Avos and other writings that relating to ethics and character, which are, of course, his Deus and some letters, which, of course, was something of great importance to the Rambam.
Okay, perhaps we'll do an episode on that with you and Rabbi Kilson together.
All right.
And we'll, like I said, we'll see when that comes out. But recording this in advance. So with that, I hope the listeners had enough of Moreh Nevuchim.
I hope they didn't have enough of Moreh Nevuchim.
No. Okay, I said that came out wrong. I didn't mean they had enough of Moreh Nevuchim, chas v'shalom, but I meant that they heard now a lot between these two episodes. I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly what the Goodman episode was, I think now we're over 3 hours of audio on Moreh Nevuchim, especially on this edition. So, and by the way, if anyone wants more, email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, reply to me on WhatsApp, tell me that you want more Moreh Nevuchim, more Rambam discussion. But that being said, I'm just saying, hopefully that they heard a lot about Moreh Nevuchim, they heard a lot about this edition. And always, I think this is a good thing. I don't often on the podcast has not talked enough about Rambam, about medieval philosophy, and this is something that I think we should talk about more on the podcast. So thank you, Shnayor, for joining me once again on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nachi, for having me. It was my great pleasure and privilege.